going to start this morning with a song by Pete Seeger. If you know it, feel free to join in. If you don't know it, you'll know it in 2 seconds. If we could consider each other a neighbor, a friend, or a brother, it could be a wonderful, wonderful world. It could be a wonderful world. Whoa, it could be a wonderful world. Let's try that. If we could consider each other a neighbor, a friend, or a brother, it could be a wonderful, wonderful world. It could be a wonderful world. Whoa, it could be a wonderful world. If each little kid could have fresh milk each day, if each working man had enough time to play, if each homeless soul had a good place to stay, it could be a wonderful world. Whoa, it could be a wonderful world. All together. If we could consider each other a neighbor, a friend, or a brother, it could be a wonderful, wonderful world. It could be a wonderful world. Whoa, it could be a wonderful world. If there were no poor and the rich were content, if strangers were welcome wherever they went, if each of us knew what true brotherhood meant, it could be a wonderful world. Oh, it could be a wonderful world. All together. If we could consider each other a neighbor, a friend, or a brother, it could be a wonderful, wonderful world. It could be a wonderful world. Oh, it could be a wonderful world.
The theme we're talking about this month in service is grace, as you have heard a bit about this morning. And I wanted to ask you all what comes to mind when you think of grace. I want to ask you all what comes to mind when you think about grace. Okay. A person's name. A lot of people think of dancers, right? Dancers are graceful. Athletes can be graceful. Sometimes grace is like a physical thing. What emotion? Okay. Mm-hmm. Say it again. Composure. Okay. Now we're rolling. So grace can be a lot of different things. And today's story is kind of about grace in a couple of different ways. Like I said, it's called Giraffes Can't Dance. And here we go. Jerry was a tall giraffe whose neck was long and slim, but their knees were awfully crooked, and their legs were rather thin. They were very good at standing still and munching shoots off trees, but when they tried to run around, they buckled at the knees. Now, every year in Africa, they hold the jungle dance, where every animal turns up to skip and prance. And this year, when the day arrived, poor Jerry felt so sad, because when it came to dancing, they were really very bad. The warthogs started waltzing, and the rhinos rock and rolled. The lions danced a tango that was elegant and bold. The chimps all did a cha-cha with a very Latin feel. And 8 baboons then teamed up for a splendid Scottish reel. Jerry swallowed bravely as they walked toward the floor, but the lions saw them coming, and they soon began to roar. "Hey, look at clumsy Jerry," the animals all sneered. "Giraffes can't dance, you silly fool. Oh, Jerry, you're so weird." Jerry simply froze up. They were rooted to the spot. They're right, Jerry thought. I'm useless. Oh, I feel like such a clot. So they crept off from the dance floor and they started walking home. They never felt so bad before, so sad and alone. Then they found a little clearing and they looked up at the sky. The moon can be so beautiful, they whispered with a sigh. Excuse me, coughed a cricket who'd seen Jerry earlier on, but sometimes when you're different, you just need a different song. Listen to the swaying grass and listen to the trees. To me, the sweetest music is those branches in the breeze. So imagine that the lovely moon is playing just for you. Everything makes music if you really want it to. With that, the cricket smiled and picked up his violin. Then Jerry felt their body do the most amazing thing. Their hooves started shuffling, making circles on the ground. Their neck was gently swaying, and their tail swishing round. They threw their legs out sideways, and they swung them everywhere. Then they did a backward somersault and leapt up in the air. Jerry felt so wonderful. Their mouth was open wide. I am dancing. Yes, I'm dancing. I'm dancing, Jerry cried. Then one by one, each animal who'd been there at the dance arrived while Jerry boogied on and watched them, quite entranced. They shouted, "It's a miracle. We must be in a dream. Jerry's the best dancer that we've ever seen." "How'd you learn to dance like that? Please, Jerry, tell us how." But Jerry simply twirled around and finished with a bow. When they raised their head and looked up at the moon and stars above, "We all can dance," they said, "when we find music that we love." What did you think of that story? I like that story. But I have to tell you, I don't love that story because in my perfect version of that story, you know what would happen? I would rather Jerry have said at the beginning, when the animals were teasing him, I would have rather Jerry said, "Hey, the heck with you. I'm going to do my thing," because that's what I think grace is sort of all about. Giving yourself time and space to be yourself. One of the many ways that grace can express itself. What do you think? Into it? All right. Cool. Let's go to class.
Get your fill to eat, but always keep that hunger. May you never take one single breath for granted. God forbid love ever leave you empty-handed. I hope you still feel small when you stand beside the ocean. Whenever one door closes, I hope one more. Promise me that you'll give faith a fighting chance. When you get the choice to sit it out or dance, I hope you dance. I hope you dance. I hope you never fear those mountains in the distance. Never settle for the path of least resistance. Living might mean taking chances, but they're worth taking. Loving might be a mistake, but it's worth making. Don't let some hell-bent heart leave you bitter. When you come close to selling out, give the heavens above more than just a passing glance. When you get the choice to sit it out or dance, I hope you dance. 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 I hope you dance.
Good morning. For reading this morning, I've brought from The Art of Grace by Sarah Kaufman. It's a little excerpt from her chapter, To Become Unstuck. She writes, "The pianist is pounding out tradition from Fiddler on the Roof, and all around the room legs are kicking. Once a week, at the headquarters of the Mark Morris Dance Group, one of the country's busiest and most acclaimed modern dance companies, a dance class engages people with Parkinson's disease. Though many of the students in the class are elderly, and some arrived using canes or walkers or motorized scooters, the lesson follows the routine of any dance class. We start small, warming up the joints. I thought I would just be an observer, but here I was in my socks trying to keep up. The rule for this class is, if you show up, you're gonna dance. Everyone sits in a circle on folding chairs or in wheelchairs. In the middle sit the two instructors, facing each other, so we all have a good view of the movement we're supposed to copy. First, we write our names in the air. Hands high, jabbing and slashing in space to music by Bach. We add punctuation, making broader slashes and big loops, singing along as the pianist plays My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean. Now, as the beat grows faster and faster in the thundering anthem of pride from Fiddler on the Roof, our arms and legs are sweeping around together in a seated folk dance that's as punchy and defiant as if we were a community of modern-day Tevyas celebrating our heritage in a little Russian village. Well, almost. One leggy, delicately built woman can't stay seated. She weaves and bobs lightly around the room. A few can move either their legs or their arms, but not both at the same time. One man is listing slightly to one side and not moving much, but his eyes follow the others, shining with obvious delight. Everyone is pretty spirited, in fact. A hunched elderly woman who is swallowed up by her wheelchair and hasn't responded to much in the class so far is holding up her trembling hands. Every now and then, she's keeping time on the armrest. We progress to larger and larger movements, and finally we're swirling across the floor in a wobbly, full-body improvisation like waves of jelly. If we think of grace as a magical combination of phrasing, fluidity, musicality, suspension, the sense that one movement leads into the next, well, all that goes away with Parkinson's. David Leventhal, one of the instructors, told me after the class as we chatted in an empty studio. But the idea is that we can get some of it back. Parkinson's affects the production of the neurotransmitter dopamine, a chemical in the brain. Dopamine regulates movement and emotional responses by making it possible for different parts of the brain to communicate with one another, coordinating the body's actions and making them smooth and controlled. When people don't get enough dopamine, control is replaced by shaking and stiffness and loss of balance and often apathy and depression. Leventhal, a former dancer in Morris's company, is the program director of Dance for PD, a course of free weekly instruction for Parkinson's patients. He has a gentle, soothing voice, pale blue eyes, and a boyishly open face, a lanky build. Most of all, he has lots of patience and a kind of quiet studiousness. The project started as an experiment. Leventhal and fellow dancer John Higginbottom had 6 students of varying abilities. One student used a cane, another a walker, and they all moved slowly and had trouble remembering steps. With lots of repetition, which is perhaps the chief secret of dancers. The two men taught them to glide and circle around the studio in a way that was musical and expressive and engaged the participants' brains through complicated patterns of awareness and space. This is where Leventhal's classes differ from therapy exercises that target strength and endurance, but may not have smoothness and fluidity as a goal. Now dozens of patients take his class each week, and Dance for PD has spread to 38 states and 12 other countries. A fascinating 2014 documentary on the program, titled Capturing Grace, chronicles the Brooklyn students' preparations for their first public performance of excerpts from Mark Morris's weighty, playful choreography. The documentary is directed by PBS correspondent Dave Iverson, who himself has Parkinson's disease, and it's been screening at film festivals all around the world. Leventhal notes that our society tells us again and again that there are people who can dance and people who should not even bother. And I think that's a tragedy. Defined by their loss of movement, people with Parkinson's may feel that because of their symptoms, they dwell outside the human experience, that they're cut off from basic pleasures of moving and belonging to a group. But the Dance for PD class makes a powerful case that grace is everybody's right. Anyone can dance. The human spirit will find a way to dance, and grace dwells in every body. Let It Be a Dance. First of all, I'd like to say thank you guys so much for doing Let It Be a Dance as your first hymn this morning, because I love that hymn. That was my mom's favorite and my favorite too. And it's a tough one to sing, so you guys did a good job. When I was about 13 or so, my mother thought it was important that I see Seneca Falls, the location of the famous Convention for Women's Suffrage in 1848. So my best friend Anne and I piled into the back of my mom's red Ford Nova and drove out along I-90. So when you travel from Buffalo, New York to Seneca Falls, it's just a straight shot down I-90, but you pass through a wetland bird refuge called Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge. Yes, they named it Montezuma's Refuge, which everyone is like, Montezuma's Revenge? No, refuge, refuge. So the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge is about 9,800 acres, set aside for wetlands conservation and migratory bird habitat. And Interstate I-90 passes directly through the center of it. So as we looked out the windows to either side, there was an enormous flock of birds, and they would rise up from the water on the one side, and they would fall to the other side, and then rise and fall, and the birds were pivoting and turning like someone was shaking out a rippling black sheet against the blue sky. It was beautiful. And my friend Anne was captivated, and she kept watching. She turned her head to watch it even as we passed through. And I remember looking up and thinking, why is this so beautiful? Why are these birds so beautiful? I still don't know. We've all had that experience, though, looking up at the sound of a rush of wings. In fact, the word for a cloud of birds like that, it's a murmuration. Isn't that neat? It's the perfect word for birds' wings. They all sound as if they're simultaneously whispering, hush. In a flock of birds or in a school of fish, there's no one leader who's controlling the action, yet they all turn together as if they're part of one body. This week, Ira Flato from Science Friday was talking with Stanford University professor Nicholas Ouellette about crowd physics. Now, their lead-in specifically was how to get all the wet, miserable people out of Times Square after the ball dropped on New Year's Eve this year. Because, it was terrible. They weren't even allowed to have umbrellas, poor things. And they wanted to get everybody out as quickly as possible. Well, he brought in Ouellette because he's been doing research on midges. Those terrible little bugs that are in clouds that are always exactly at head height no matter where your head goes. And he's been trying to apply thermodynamic principles to the swarm movements of midges. In other words, he's comparing the movement of midges in a swarm to the movements of atoms in a material. And he says that this comparison, you can use the same types of mathematical models to track both types of movement. The comparison is not, of course, a strict one, because midges, as tiny as their little tiny brains are, they do actually have volition. They have their own will, whereas as far as we know, particles do not, although in twine string theory, people, that could be. Another interesting study that Ouellette is a part of found that when he looked closely at marathons, the race as a whole, not the individual runners, but the race as a whole, behaves like waves. And the movement of the runners is similar to light, in that light can be seen as individual particles, the individual quanta of light, or as a wave, which would be like the race as a whole. It's curious to think of people this way, that it's not just our social actions that bring light to the world, but that our physical actions can also mirror the properties of light. We're not used to thinking of grace as something that would come naturally, like something that we would naturally be a mirror to the light of the world. Or maybe we feel like grace is something that slowly leaches out of us with age. When I watch my girls playing at the park, there's grace to that whirl of children whipping amongst the play structures and calling to one another, just like there's that grace of the birds in the cloud. But if I'm asked about grace, what comes directly to my mind is dance. And dance is the opposite of unstructured, buoyant joy at play. Dance requires study. Not just study, but particular study of spatial awareness. When you're dancing, I took a couple classes in dance, I'm terrible at it, but when you're dancing, you're training your body in specific muscle movements until those muscle movements are the default patterns of your body. So I'm not a dancer, but my friend Michelle is, and she owns a studio, and she says that she can pick out dancers just in a random crowd of people. She can look out in the crowd, and she's like, oh, there's a dancer. Oh, that one's modern. Like, she can actually tell the difference in carriage because of the type of muscle patterns that are encouraged just by the way that people carry themselves in regular non-dance movement. So when you're dancing, when you're on stage, there's a director or there's a choreographer who's carefully curating the audience experience, who's watching to make sure that each movement that each dancer makes has a finished product that doesn't contain jarring notes that distract from the beauty of the composition as a whole. The combination of music and movement can come together to form something even more graceful and even more beautiful. So when we think of things that, what I call the epitome of human grace, maybe you would think of it as sports instead, because lots of people don't watch dance and lots of people do watch sports. But when you think about movements that are the epitome of human grace, like a coordinated football team out on the field, go Eagles, there's always a leader who's directing the way that everybody else is going to move. So in dance, it would be the choreographer, it would be the director. In football, it might be the coach. And that is, in a restaurant kitchen, you don't think of restaurant kitchens as being particularly graceful, especially if you're watching something like Top Chef. But when you see an actual working restaurant kitchen, it's very graceful. Everyone is moving in and out amongst each other from different stations, one to the other, getting everything ready on time and not dropping plates. And you know if somebody drops a plate because you hear, woo, from the kitchen. Like, celebration, someone dropped a plate. But as graceful as that back of house may be, it's graceful because there's someone keeping track of what everyone has to do next and where everyone has to be. So why then is it that we find natural exhibits of grace so enthralling? A herd of horses that starts off across a field catches our attention effortlessly, or a flock of butterflies swirling and swirling in the wind. There's something about the way that they move that says that this is what they were meant to do. So maybe grace is about doing what you were meant to do. In her book, The Art of Grace, on Moving Well Through Life, Pulitzer Prize-winning dance critic Sarah Kaufman writes about Motown in the 1960s. So maybe you all have heard this story before, but I found it fascinating, so I'm going to tell you all again. So Berry Gordy Jr. was born in Detroit in 1929 as the seventh of 8 children of Berry Gordy Sr. and Bertha Fuller Gordy. Gordy loved music all his life, and after returning home from serving in the U.S. Army during the Korean War, he began writing songs at night while supporting his family with a day job at an auto manufacturing plant. Gordy worked really hard, and he, through a series of fortunate and lucky events, series of grace that was given to him, he found success as a songwriter. So in 1959, he expanded his vision. With an $800 loan from his family's Burberry co-op, he set out to, as one biographer put it, apply the principles learned in the auto plant to the production of records and the creation of music groups and solo artists. So when you hear about like the Detroit sound being part of Motor City, really was part of Motor City. That's really what he was going for. He thought that he could get that beautiful, graceful music out of people through a process. So Gordy bought a house at 2648 West Grand Boulevard in Detroit. He named it Hitsville, USA, because, he was very humble. And he proceeded to turn out hit after hit, songs that we all still recognize, like Money, yeah, that's what I want, and Shop Around, you better shop around, shop, and My Guy. And My Guy actually was the first Billboard song that topped the charts that was an African American song. So it topped both the charts used to be segregated, and it topped both the white charts and the black charts. And that's pretty amazing. 1964. Well, the stars who were discovered by Gordy in Motown Records, they were not from the upper classes. They were from working class neighborhoods. As an example, the famous Smokey Robinson was from what biography.com euphemistically calls a rough neighborhood in Detroit. Diana Ross was Smokey Robinson's neighbor. The other members of the Supremes, well, Florence Ballard grew up moving from housing project to housing project in Detroit, and Mary Wilson was born in segregated Greenville, Mississippi, and moved around all through the country until she finally settled in Detroit's Brewster Douglas projects. Well, one thing that was really important to Gordy was that the artists he produced would be taken seriously as artists. And this was the 1960s, and segregation and racism were tangible and overt in ways that they are not today. Like it or not, the artists of Motown would be representing all black people to a white audience that probably didn't know anybody who was black. Gordy realized that the young men and women who he mentored would need to be prepared for the spotlight, and so he brought in a woman named Maxine Powell. Maxine Powell's New York Times obituary gives a short history of the way that she was found. So Powell moved to Detroit in the 1940s and founded her own finishing school and modeling school. And she was actually one of the first people to work with the auto industry to specifically market automobiles to the African-American audiences. So she placed black models in campaigns for city automakers. And one of her models was Gwen Gordy, who was Berry Gordy's sister. And she told her brother that Maxine Powell was the person that he needed to bring on board. So at Motown, performers were required to take class for 2 days a week with Powell whenever they were in Detroit. Didn't matter how famous they were, what venues they were playing, they had to go to finishing school. 2 days a week, at least 2 hours a day. She taught deportment, both on the stage and off the stage. She taught her charges to behave with grace, no matter what situation they may find themselves in. And Berry Gordy is quoted as saying that Powell brought something to Motown that no other record company had. Paul Serena, Flashback.com, compiled a bunch of interviews with and about Ms. Powell in his 2015 article, Diana Ross and Maxine Powell's Motown Charm School. And in that article, Powell describes in her own words her instructional goals. She says, I opened in 1964 a finishing school, Motown Finishing School, and I worked with the artists. The first thing we worked on was, who are you? What makes you tick? Because I don't teach singing, so I told the artists that I would groom and polish them so they could appear in any number of places around the country, and even before a king or a queen. Of course, the youngsters, they came from humble beginnings, and some were rude and crude from the street and the projects, but with me, it isn't where you come from, it's where you're going. So I told them where they would be appearing. And they laughed and said I was out of my mind, because all they wanted was a hit record. But this is what we did. We worked with developing class. It's a funny thing. No matter who you are, when you purchase a flower or a plant, the first thing you ask is, how do I keep this plant and keep it growing beautiful? Well, people need that same concern. And she goes on to say, I work with posture and dealing with clearness of mind and knowing who you are and how to handle your body on stage, how to handle yourself on and off the stage. See, because if you think that you're going to come on stage and be classy or whatever, well, that's not going to happen because you're a big phony. What you have to be, you have to live what you're doing all day long. She thought that was really important because she knew that these people would be representatives of an entire group of people. And when the Supremes actually did meet the Queen of England, well, they knew what to do. In her book, Kaufman holds up many examples of grace and then decries the lack of grace in today's culture, which, can you blame her? But, I was kind of sad that during her discussion of grace in tennis, she took the time to disparage Serena Williams. But you know what? When I looked at her background, I thought of something else. Kaufman is a dance critic, and she started dancing in elementary school and didn't stop studying dance until graduate school. So she sees nuances of grace that we mere mortals might miss. But in a way, I think she's poorer for it because her critical eye causes her to see imperfection where we, the untrained, would simply see beauty. Before I had my girls, I had a job in the financial sector, and I had a group of really good friends. They've all moved on to different jobs now, and I've moved on to a different job, which is 2 girls. But I can take the lessons I learned from my friends with me. And one lesson was this. Now, I don't remember what exactly sparked the conversation, so I'm going to go with what I kind of remember, which is one of the guys tried to open a door for me at a restaurant. And, he was raised that it is polite and it shows respect for a gentleman to open a door for a lady. And I was refusing to allow him to open the door for me because I was raised that a strong and capable woman is perfectly able to open her own door, thank you. And it's weird to make a point of swooping in to do something for someone when they're handling it just fine on their own. Well, what he said to me really stuck with me. He said, "Don't step on someone else's blessings. You give a gift to someone else when you allow them the grace to help you. You give a gift to everyone when you have the grace to gloss over the imperfections and the rough edges to appreciate the spirit of an action." So every time that I'm tempted to turn down a compliment with, "Oh, no, it was nothing," I remember that, and I think I'm going to try to have the grace to remember that it's their grace, and if I don't accept it, then I'm telling them that their grace is not welcome. I mean, have any of you ever done that? You turn away a compliment because you don't feel like you deserve it? Or you turn down help because you feel like, "Oh, I don't want to put you to any bother, I can manage"? Yeah, it's difficult to accept grace when we don't feel like we deserve it. But that's actually what grace is. Grace is a gift that we may or may not deserve. So we have to go out and accept it. It's difficult, because of course we're able to live on our own. I mean, given the proper opportunities and training, we probably could even do everything for ourselves. I mean, at the PA farm show yesterday, I was walking behind a guy who had a T-shirt that said, "Without trucks, you'd be homeless, hungry, and naked." And I thought, But the trucks bring my lumber to the lumber store so that I can get it to my house and fix my house. The trucks bring my food to the grocery store. The trucks bring all of my clothes from China all the way over here because we don't make anything in the U.S. anymore. But, we probably could do everything ourselves. But one of the wonderful things about being human is that we have a community. We are in community with one another, and we have this gift of grace that we can give to one another, so that we have people who specialize in moving the food from the farm to the grocery store so that we can get it home and cook it. We have people who specialize in growing the food that we make. I was just at the farm show, so I'm thinking about growing food and where the food comes from. I got to see a baby cow born yesterday. And the first steps of a baby cow, that's really grace. Oh my goodness. Perfection in a Christian sense means becoming mature enough to give ourselves to others. Whatever we have, no matter how little it seems, is something that can be shared with those who don't have it. And one thing I noticed that as I was writing this is that I kept trying to differentiate between grace in physical actions, like walking down the street, and grace in social actions, like stopping to let a family with an unwieldy stroller pass. Those are both graceful actions. They can both be done with grace. And maybe the reason I have trouble discriminating in language between the types of grace is because there isn't really a difference there. Cultivating grace means paying attention to how you move through the world. And we don't just move physically through the world. We also move socially through the world. We try to pretend that our bodies and our minds are separate, but we are all one being. And grace in one sphere bleeds over to grace in another. So Kaufman ends her book with tips for inviting grace into our lives. And she says, one thing you can do is you can slow down, you can practice tolerance and compassion, you can make room for other people in your life, you can make things easy for yourself and for others. She says, be easily pleased. Accept compliments. Take that seat on the bus if someone offers it to you. Embrace any kindness that comes your way. That's graciousness, and it's a gift to someone else. You're giving another person the gift of being graceful. Because you know what? We are all always dancing together. We are together in great murmurations of human lives that meet and intermingle. But unlike the birds, we're not always sensitive to the movements of our neighbors. But the grace that allows us to move smoothly through the dance of our lives requires attention. So we must pay attention to our actions and to our actions, the ones that are social and the ones that are physical, so that our dance can continue. Blessed be.
Wonderful, wonderful.